So here we are, the last session, the last day of Mix, and you guys chose to spend it with me. I'm honored. Thank you. That you didn't leave early or decide to go and gamble instead. So you had a lot of options. There's Rock Band outside, things like that. I really do appreciate everybody coming in and hanging out and talking about international user experiences. So a bit about what this talk is actually going to cover and what it's not going to cover. In particular, what it's not going to cover. Things like brand translation mishaps that are famous throughout popular culture. Things like the Coca-Cola brand being mistranslated into Bite the Wax Tadpole or things like that you've probably heard about. We're not going to talk about any of that stuff. We're going to talk about specifically how international will affect software design decisions and software technology decisions that you make as you write software. So, getting right into it, there are a number of reasons why making a world-ready application makes a lot of sense. First of all, it allows you to go into markets easily once you have the infrastructure in place within your application to essentially scale out to X number of markets that you decide to deploy in. Eventually, you may decide that you may need to translate these things into a number of different markets, and setting up that infrastructure properly allows you to lower overall translation costs and localization services to your eventual customers that will receive the product that you're going to be deploying globally. It will increase customer satisfaction in that it looks like you are essentially delivering unto them a culturally sensitive and relevant experience to them. One of the most important points in being very conscientious about being world ready is to avoid costly mistakes. And believe you me, this thing is full of pitfalls. There are so many things you can do wrong and a few things you can do right. And also avoid potential lawsuits, which range from the sort of benign to potentially the rather extreme of, let's say you get a country's borders wrong and the subsidiary head winds up getting hauled off to jail. These things can really happen, and they're not something you want to deal with either from a PR standpoint or from an engineering standpoint, having to fix them later. But perhaps the most important reason why you might consider making your application world ready is because the boss said you had to. This happens a lot. I had that happen to me a long time ago. Once upon a time when I was a software developer, boss comes up and says, all right, we're going to go out in Japan. So we're like, okay. And then we did a little evaluation as to what it would take, and we eventually convinced him that it wasn't really worth it because of various business reasons. But that was the old days. These days, there's actually a lot of options that you have on the table to make this sort of process go a lot smoother and easier, and we'll dig into some of those. One of the key things, actually before I go on to the next thing, could I see a show of hands? Who in the audience has actually deployed a piece of software internationally? And by internationally, I mean to a country other than the United States. All right, excellent. We've got a few. For those of you who have done it, you probably are aware that details are everything, absolutely everything, and that there are so many things that we take for granted when we write software here in the United States that cultural assumptions, language assumptions, editorial assumptions, imagery assumptions, which we have a great example of over here, about things that unless everybody on the team is really thinking in an international mindset, and by everybody, I mean everybody from program management to designers to writers to developers to test, everybody has to be thinking about international, and there really is no substitute for a collaborative team and everybody looking out for all of the potential pitfalls, again, like I said, of which there are many. So a couple things on terminology so that at least we here in the room and those who are streaming this online later are speaking the same language. There's a few terms that are important to know when we talk about world-ready software. Globalization is tossed around a lot, and basically globalization is primarily in the domain of the development team. It's the process of writing a programmatic core of software that the design is not solely based on a single language or culture, so that it can change cultural iconography, different date formats, things like that, and sort orders in the application without having to change the code base. Localizability is something I put into the designer camp, and that is essentially, again, with that single code base, a set of software that allows you to translate and actually display translated content within the software so that it is accessible by other cultures. Localization itself is essentially translation, but it's a little bit more than that. Generally, in this process, you'll have a vendor that will be doing the localization for you. And localization starts off with translation, but it also involves a certain amount of cultural sensitivity in the images and the actual terminology that is displayed within the application. Lastly, marketization, which is kind of a made-up term that we did. A little bit of background on me is I worked for the international program management team at Microsoft before I recently became an evangelist. That's why I'm here. And that was in charge of helping out the engineering teams and the designers and all that and deploying apps globally. And at Windows Live, they have this term called marketization. And marketization is the customization of an application or piece of software so that the features within it are relevant to a given country that you're deploying it in. So this is sort of a broader base, sort of if you take things in an application that are specific to one particular market, say Japan, you're only releasing a feature in Japan, you're now marketizing that application so that it is aware of what Japan is and changes its feature set so that it is market appropriate. And that can have, there's any number of business reasons why you might do it. It's mostly business reasons, some of them technical, some of them cultural, but for the most part you may have to take into account partnerships that may graft onto your application that only exist in some countries, things like that. So overall, the basic software workflow is pretty much unchanged when you're working with international. There's a couple of key differences, but this is how the process works in general. You start off with requirements, things happen, blah, 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 and then somebody says, okay, we need to deploy internationally. Hopefully, the specification does more than my little baby specification over here and just mention we need to go global. In general, and program managers, if there's any program managers either listening to this later or out in the crowd, we're not going to talk about you, sorry, but I will say that it is really important as part of this overall collaborative effort that we're talking about that you, in your specifications, make as much effort as possible to incorporate learnings and international deployment strategies into your specification in as detailed a way as possible. So specifications is where we start. That kicks off, goes to the design team. The design writes a lovely UI based on what is required by the business. And there's a little bit of back and forth as the designers say, goodness gracious, program managers, you can't design it. That's not going to work. So there's a natural conversation that goes on over there. Design, once they've got that finalized, kicks it off to the development team. They begin to code it. The developers then go back to the designers and say, are you guys crazy? You can't actually write something like that. There's a conversation that goes on there. Then the coders kick it off to the test. Test says, oh my gosh, you wrote it horribly. And then there's bugs that are filed and then back and forth there. Eventually, you release the software. What we're going to focus in on today is this part right in here, code and design. So we're going to break that out a little bit more and go into some more detail. The process to make international software workflow really work is that in that conversation between design and code and the development staff is at some point there needs to be a set date at which the UI will no longer be changed. And this, I have found, is extraordinarily difficult to commit to and adhere to for a number of reasons, mostly because the reality on the ground is that it's extremely difficult to lock anything down permanently without actually making subsequent changes. But when you're deploying a piece of software globally, late changes after a UI freeze, especially once you have begun the localization process and spun up your external vendors who are going to be going in and actually translating the software, imagine if you are essentially translating into 30 different languages, but suddenly the UI freezes after they've started. Well, that's going to get expensive. Another thing to know about localization vendors overall is that they tend to work best when you give them large chunks of work. So if you begin them on a 10,000 word project for 10 different languages, and then you stop, and then you make one small word change that has to then be replicated across all those different languages, well, now you have to spin up the whole process again and go through submitting the content over to them. They'll find the right people, they'll bring them in, they'll translate your one word, and then that one word will cost you, thousands of dollars as opposed to maybe 50 cents of what it should have costed when you actually had a number of different ones. So the cost savings of getting this process right can be immense. So my advice to you is wherever and whenever possible, seriously, set a UI freeze date and keep to it. Once localization comes back from your vendor, whatever that may be, then there should be some sort of acceptance test process. And you don't need testers who actually speak the language necessarily, but it's always best to have somebody either at least familiar with what looks right and what looks wrong. A lot of times that you're just not going to have the resources to be able to effectively test for real in all different markets, but you do the best you can. You look for formatting errors, truncation, in bidirectional, you look for iconography that is flipped unnecessarily or contextually goes away. Arrows, for example, if they don't flip the correct direction, you lose all context and it's just broken. So things like that. If you have somebody in the market that you're going to be deploying the software to, it's always great to have them actually participate in the acceptance test as well. Give them some early builds of the software, have them check it out, make sure that they sign off on whether or not it looks good to them and whether or not the translation may be of a high enough quality to be accepted by the market that you're going to be deploying to. So that's the change right there. And so that's the key difference between just normally deploying in the US or any English-speaking country and what you have to do for translated software, sort of at a high level. So let's dig down a little bit deeper into some of the very specific things that designers in particular can look out for as you are designing applications for the world market. Again, localizability, if it's done right in collaboration of the design team and the technical team, really does empower scale if done right. So basically, if you design your UI and your software so that it can handle any number of different languages and markets, then you save pretty considerably. Do it wrong, and those mistakes get multiplied over any number of different languages that you've decided to deploy in. So it's imperative that you get the design right and get the content right up front in English, and then that will actually allow you to have a smooth, happy translation time into all the other languages that you're going to be deploying in and a smooth software rollout. In an ideal world, this is what always happens. In reality, problems happen all the time. So some specific things is that designers should be and ask for a code base that essentially can accommodate any number of language sets by default. This is getting easier to do. Something I want designers to be aware of is that this is now possible, and you don't have to drill down into the real nitty-gritty with your development team as to actually how. Just make sure that is something that they are enabling. String expansion is kind of a big deal. German, for those of you who speak German, it has a number of characters. String expansion can be anything from 30 to 50% longer for the equivalent English space taken up. So designers, your UI, you need to take into account the fact that English buttons and controls are not necessarily going to be the same size when they are translated. They could be shorter, and in a lot of cases they're going to be longer. So watch out for that and create design that is flexible and that allows for inherent string expansion that comes from localizing into a number of different languages. If you're lucky, then you actually will be able to have some idea for what the lengths are going to be. Oftentimes, you just won't know until you actually go, especially for new UI features rather than revised UI features. It's nearly impossible to say unless you happen to speak the language yourself. So in line with that, avoid overcrowding dialogues, Windows forms, anything that you have that involves a lot of text. Try to give it some breathing room and just anticipate textual growth. A lot of times it's just a rule of thumb, but the more disciplined you get at it, the better it works. And plus, airy designs are in vogue these days, so it's kind of nice. One tip for developers, that if you happen to be designing a Win32 application or a WinForm app, then you should try to use the .NET concept of auto layout, which is kind of like the table in HTML. So it allows you to essentially drop controls and things like that into a flexible grid layout that allows you to move and expand as the controls grow or shrink. And so that's actually kind of a handy way to circumvent the sort of just we're going to eyeball it and allow for extra space to accommodate string expansion. So if possible, and that does take a little bit of extra work, but it will pay off in spades if you actually go through the trouble to make it in the first place. And this is one of the huge pet peeves that if you want to drive your translation folks nuts, then do this. And this is actually kind of subtle. It happens a lot in software. And what's wrong with this? Does anybody know what's wrong with this? I'll show you. It's two things. That and that. So what's wrong is that the text entry happens in the middle of the string. And what that actually gets, and I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in concepts here. When you separate content from code, you generally put all these things into some sort of resource file, be it an XML file, a resx file, or a .resource file. Those are using .NET concepts, which I'm going to use throughout. The same thing applies if you happen to be using another programming language. There's going to be some sort of resource separation. In a resource separating scenario, that string right there will be represented as reset fail count to 0 after end of resource. New resource, days, parentheses S. Now, you put them right next to each other in the resource file, everything's good. Then somebody comes along later, they add a new resource, they don't care, they just plug it in anywhere because it doesn't really matter where it goes, and over time, days and reset fail count get farther and farther apart. They no longer are connected in a resource file because it doesn't really matter where they come from. You're pulling in resources based on their ID. So what happens is your translation staff gets reset fail count to 0 after, and then the word days. And so they have to translate those two things separately without the context anymore. They no longer benefit from what you know is that these two things are going to go together. And so as a result, they might pick the wrong essence of the word days in order to translate it, and you could come up with something that doesn't make sense anymore in context. So in general, wherever possible, you need to keep all of these string resources as full, complete sentences all the time. The other thing that's wrong with this is the plural, their conditional plural, the parenthesis S that we all love here in English. It doesn't exist in other languages, sorry. It just doesn't. So you have to, this is hard because everybody loves, item, parenthesis S, day, parenthesis S, for one or more of whatever the thing is that you happen to be trying to gather data on. You have to wean yourself off of those things. And it's hard at first because it requires a bunch of extra thought as to, okay, well, great. We have to get rid of them, but now we have to reword this thing so that it somehow makes sense. Generally, you have to pick either a singular or a plural and go for it because in other languages, the noun-verb agreement can change the gender of it's complicated. I only speak English personally, but anyway, just don't do that because it'll drive your translators nuts. So the correct example of how to do this simple little thing is actually this. So again, now we've got the entire string off to the side. We've committed to days as a plural, which is great. It'll make your translation staff happy. The text collection form is off to the right, so the resource will be a single unit, and everybody's happy. And it still makes sense, which is ideal. So it takes a little bit of extra thought and effort, but again, totally worth it. Again, on the content side, clear and consistent terminology, that mostly means tone and word choice. When you decide to, when your application is talking about concepts, try to use clear, natural language that people use when talking to each other. The reason for that is that technical style language and posturing within software and how you communicate to your users tends to break down when you have other languages that don't have the same sort of nomenclature. So try to be conversational wherever possible, and if you are talking about a term throughout an application, be consistent in how you talk about it. My favorite examples are some of the technical and colloquial phrases that come up. Dangerously low on disk space is very ominous and can actually, if not translated with much care, can actually confer a little bit more, I think, urgency than maybe you are trying to convey, as in personal danger to you as an individual if your disk runs out of space, which isn't what you're trying to convey at all. Or my personal favorite example, which is a real-world example, by the way, unable to fork daemon. Yeah, how that gets translated into Japanese just boggles the mind. All sorts of problems can come from that. So, I mean, these kinds of problems tend to arise from, you have an error message. They realize that they need to throw some sort of error. The development staff's like, oh crud, well let's just write it, and then so they do. But of course, they're in a technical mindset, and they're not thinking about necessarily how that's going to translate, or even whether or not it's really understandable. So, but they do the best they can, and I appreciate that. But again, this is more to the teamwork point. As long as everybody is thinking about international and the ramifications of what happens when you put words into your application, you might think twice. Maybe unable to fork daemon isn't the best way to communicate this exact point that I'm trying to make here. And again, if you happen to have professional writers who are working on your project, it is always best that whenever there is some sort of additional thing that you need to convey, you should run it past them so that they can at least try to act as a quality filter for the kinds of words that you use within the app. Always try to minimize, and this is impossible to entirely get rid of acronyms and abbreviations, but try to minimize them wherever possible, because, I mean, in international translation, I don't know how DHCP and NAC are going to work out, but just overall, that sentence doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me by itself. And because your translation staff, and by the way, never assume that your translators are as technical as you are, because a lot of times they're just going to farm it out to somebody out in country, and you never know. So they're there to translate stuff. They may be technical, they may not. So try to avoid these highly technical things if it is at all avoidable. And if you do have technical content that you need, then you need special translators in order to handle that. And you should generally try to comment your resource files so that you try to help them wherever possible, because some of this stuff can be a real tough thing to actually get across. My favorite. So there are a number of different pitfalls when dealing with imagery. And imagery is fun. Imagery helps an application. It helps get the point across. It looks nice, things like that, all very good. But I was, in preparing for this demonstration, I was showing it to a friend of mine who also works at Microsoft, and she was telling me about a project that she was running that was deploying worldwide, and how the design team hadn't actually taken into account the fact that it was going to be worldwide, and they had used embedded text and images everywhere. And as a result, even though they had actually saved all the original layered imagery, which is good, if you have to use embedded text and images, do save the layered version of it forever, because you're probably going to need to come back and either give that to your vendor to translate or do it yourself. But so they had done this, and it actually completely blew their budget. They spent their entire budget, literally, on just the image part. So this is a real budget buster. You have to think of it whenever you use text and images like you are digging in your pocket and you are handing over a lump of gold. That is basically how you should think about it. And there are other ways around it that you can use. For example, just sidestep the issue entirely. Just don't use the text at all. If there is some other alternative, you should try to use it. Or if it is unavoidable, then just try to use it sparingly, basically. Or if perhaps you're in a web application, you can just use some of the hot new CSS styles and overlay text over an image. So the options available to you vary depending upon the situation, but just understand the gravity of what it is, because it is a simple thing to embed text into images, but it has real consequences down the road. And the last thing you want to do is have to go back to the boss and say, yeah, about that translation budget, it's going to have to double. They never like that. Gender and ethnic stereotypes pretty much speak for themselves. Things to do are create the amorphous blob person. Always a good strategy. Nobody's going to get offended by the amorphous blob person except perhaps your design staff, who thinks that the amorphous blob person isn't hip or cool, in which case I highly encourage you to come up with a hip and cool amorphous blob person. That person, made by Microsoft. You know how these things go. Avoiding cultural specific examples, like a mailbox. Not all countries have mailboxes. This was an interesting thing that I didn't know before I actually came into this business, is that the mailbox is kind of an American thing. It's a North American thing. They're not everywhere. They're not always the same shape. Some countries, they just don't exist. So if you are trying to express the concept of mail, it is best to boil it down to its real heart and soul, which is what everybody pretty much universally understands as the envelope. This also happens in a number of other scenarios. If you are feeling particularly green in your application design and you're trying to represent a light bulb and you think, hey, cool, we should do one of those compact fluorescent cool things. Well, not everybody has those either. So you might want to, just be careful in what imagery you use and think about, is it everywhere? Is everybody going to understand this? Is it the right sort of thing to do? And if you need to check, then there's no substitute to actually going online and asking somebody exactly whether or not this is good. Like any planned imagery might work out. You'd be surprised at how people are really willing to sort of jump to your aid and help with this sort of thing. It really makes a big difference. And back to our original example that we used in the beginning about gestures, things like this, that, not going to work, not at all, because there is just no way to tell what is or is not acceptable. My understanding is there are places in China where sticking out your tongue is actually a greeting. It's crazy. So just avoid the issue entirely, and either eliminate it or come up with a better way to communicate the same fundamental concept of whatever it is that you're trying to get at. So in this case, getting rid of the OK with a checkbox saying that we're good. Maps. Maps are troublesome. Maps are actually deceptively troublesome in that a lot of applications where maps are called for, there's a number of different things you can do. I actually had an engineering team that spent a long time writing their own map, and it was gorgeous. It was awesome, and they spent weeks and weeks. I think they did it by hand. It was all beautiful and vector-based. And when it came time to actually do an international review, we saw this and we're like, okay, where did you get the map? And they're like, okay, we made it ourselves, to which we said, okay, so here's a number of reasons why you're not going to want to do that. For example, the example over here is a portion of Guyana that is disputed. Venezuela claims that portion of land. So now you have essentially two choices. If you are representing South America, you can just draw the border right where that dotted line is, and if you happen to be coloring the countries differently, well, you'll just color in Venezuela one color and Guyana the other one and call it good. Well, now Venezuela is angry at you. You have just essentially violated what they think their borders are. Or you can say, all right, well, we'll make Venezuela happy and we'll color it in over here. Well, now you've made Guyana unhappy because now you've essentially violated their sovereignty. The best thing to do in this situation is just don't do maps yourself, because it's a constantly shifting thing, very, very sensitive, and countries really, really get upset when you get this wrong. And I don't think you want to be in the middle of arbitrating between Kosovo and whatever other body may be trying to keep it from becoming a country. Do you really want to be in the middle of something like that? You don't, trust me. So take some sort of external map source, for example, Microsoft Virtual Earth, just put in a quick product plug, something that you can actually use in your software to actually just get out of the map business entirely. There's a number of other different solutions available. This is one of them. It's great if you have web apps, because there's a whole bunch of easy to consume ones. If you're writing packaged software, again, Virtual Earth happens to have a nice little solution about that, so you can go in and look for more information there. Seriously, maps can get you into trouble. Just try to leave it to the experts. Okay, designers, thanks for sticking with me. Now, designers, again, the developer stuff it's going to be technical, so I'm going to need you to stick with me. But again, in the spirit of collaboration, it's important that you know what they're dealing with, and developers, it's important you know what the designers are dealing with, because in the end, there's no substitute for everybody knowing exactly what's going on. In general, you want to write an application that can display any currency, any size of number, any sort order. These are common things that change per culture. And you can try to simulate it. In the old days, it was a tough process actually making all of these things work out. In this day and age, the process has become dramatically simpler. I'm not 100% up on what is available in other programming platforms, but if you happen to be writing these things in .NET, then there is a massive amount of libraries that you can use that just make this stuff downright easy. So I would highly recommend that you take a look, and if you happen to be writing an application that you need to deploy to the world, get familiar with the tools that are available to you. That URL is a great place to start. I've got a whole bunch of other ones at the end of this slide, or at this presentation, that will describe more about what's going on. You really don't want to attempt to simulate this, because it is, again, very, very easy to get wrong. And sometimes in some situations it can be tempting to attempt to, say, just write your own date parting, and you have a string that happens to have just month, and then you're like, well, I'm going to put month, and then I'm just going to add the day over here myself. In general, if you're dealing with things like that, you should always use the base types for that sort of data. So actually use the built-in data types for date or currency or things like that. A quick example in .NET, again, sorry, is that if you needed to write out some quick currency, then as part of the thread classes, you have a current culture, which actually will change the output of this particular example to whatever the user's current culture is within the operating system. So that's a super quick way to just sort of by default just handle everything. So if you write everything like this, then your application will automatically just switch to whatever is appropriate and display something that means something to the user. And there are a lot of different ways to display this data, believe you me. Unicode is a complicated topic, one that I'm not going to go into in terrible detail here, because there is a lot to talk about on the Unicode front. Basically, Unicode is a way of encoding information. Unicode doesn't work by itself without Unicode is a means of storing information. It doesn't work without an encoding system. There are two popular choices. These are UTF-8 and UTF-16. In general, and this is more of a guideline than a rule, you want to use UTF-8 for web-based applications or any sort of interoperability between one application and another, particularly XML, things like that. If you are writing WinForm applications, the guide is to generally use UTF-16 as your encoding. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty details as to why, But I would highly encourage you that if you're interested, if you're interested in learning about Unicode, that URL right there, great place to start. It's a very long document. There's a lot to know. But again, if you're a developer, I have bad news for you. You have no choice. You have to know this sort of stuff. So I would go there, get familiar with all the different things that are available, and and be aware of the one exception, which is email. If your application sends email, then UTF-8 ain't going to work anymore. Sorry. You have to actually wind up using the more antiquated ISO types or Shift.js for Japanese and other such pre-Unicode and UTF-8 encoding standards. There's a number of reasons for this, but it's mostly because email hasn't really caught up. We're getting there. It's getting closer. The situation will, I imagine, change in the future, but for the most part, if you want your email to be read by the largest number of email clients, the safest thing to do is to actually revert back to the old encoding types for email alone, which can be a bit of a hassle, and there's just no way around it, I'm afraid. Another thing to keep in mind as a developer and as a designer, that there are a number of different input mechanisms into an application when you start taking into account international. Keyboards are not the same the world over. They are, and in some cases, pretty dramatically different. For the most part, if you're deploying an application onto a Windows device, then you don't have to worry about this as much, but you should just be aware in general that this exists out there and that there are differences to how keyboards are laid out, what keys are even available on them, and even how people interact with software. So a great example of that is the IME, the Input Method Editor. So for complicated scripts such as Japanese and Chinese, where there are more characters to represent than are physically available on a device, then it relies on software assist that is provided as part of Windows to allow you to basically enter the characters. So the user input experience can change pretty dramatically from one culture to another. It's important to be aware of this, and it is important that it's most important if you start deviating from things like the standard .NET edit controls and start writing your own. You need to actually take into account the fact that there are a number of different input methods and roll it into your application. Or just not write custom controls and use the .NET edit controls wherever possible to save yourself time and energy. That's what I usually recommend. Fonts. So in addition to Unicode, fonts are actually kind of a big deal. This over here is an example of what happens when things go horribly wrong. What happened here, actually, is a couple of different instances of and this is important, what it looks like when the font that you choose to display cannot find the character that you are trying to display. And that's a very important distinction. That's when you see the boxes. Boxes means you have a font problem. Question marks mean you have an encoding problem. Completely different situations. So actually, this is really handy to know this distinction because font problem is relatively easy to fix. So there are a number of different best practices to use for fonts. It includes actually picking the right one for the culture that you're using. A lot of times, if they on an operating system, this is kind of handled for you. But in a web scenario, you actually have to make good font choices. Size is also an important issue in choosing fonts, especially for kanji in Japanese, definitely Chinese and the part of Japanese that actually uses some of the Chinese characters. They are so complicated that if you start representing them in a very small size, they become literally unreadable. So you have to at least use a 9-point size or larger wherever possible. And that's something that you can change per application. If you're writing a web application, you should have all of your font and style attributes in one or more CSS files per locale that you're going to be going out to so that there can be customization and you can encapsulate all of that into something that is a package that allows you to easily change it out depending on what culture is selected by the user or whatever sort of cultural detection software you happen to write on top of it. And again, as everything in here. There's lots more information to read, and there'll be a quick, oops, sorry, going the wrong way. The absolute most important thing that developers can do to enable world-ready software is resource separation. And there's a couple of different ways you can do this, and it keeps getting better and better with each rev of Visual Studio and .NET. Right now, the preferred hip way to do it is to use satellite assemblies, which are basically external DLL resources that have a naming convention that allow you to actually specify the culture within it. Your application can specify what the default or neutral culture is within an application. And basically, at a core, it's just separating code from content. Similar to how they do it in the web, you want to do this over here in your application. So if you have a resource that is going to be displayed, text, graphics, things like that, put it in a resource file so that then you can add more, you can take them away, you can change them out. It's pretty easy, and it will save you a ton of time. And a bit back, if you remember our overall software process where we talked about localization, those resource files are then what you can send off to a good international vendor that can then do the translation for you. It can be that simple because especially if you use resx files, which are essentially XML, so it's all text within text, you're pretty much good to go. The advantages of this are from a single binary or deployment, you can deploy any number of cultures and have the user be able to switch between them automatically. So they say, yeah, actually, I don't want Japanese anymore, I want English. Boom. And then the application could change on the fly and just incorporate the resources that are relevant to the user's choice, and the UI can change. A bunch of the Windows Live applications have this capability. A little trick, if you want to change it on your own, to go to any of the Windows Live apps and add a question mark MKT equals things like ENUS is the English one, or change it for the four-letter locale of your choice, and you can switch the UI that way. It's fun to experiment. And so they all use this technology to actually do UI switching on the fly, and it's pretty neat. So again, more information, you can get it right there. So in summary, what is all this about? Bringing it back all together. There's lots of parts, as you can see. There's lots of stuff going on. There's lots of ramifications to what it means to go worldwide. Teamwork is the key. If everybody on the team knows what can go wrong and what the best practices are, then it is vastly easier to do this. If you just have a program management staff that is in charge of it, but the developers aren't really up on it, then this will go a little sideways. Especially if, basically it just takes collaboration across the board. In an ideal world, you have a little bit of extra time and you can set up a set of international best practices for your company so that you can have everybody on the same page and aligned properly across the entire project team or project teams that you happen to be working on. I highly recommend everybody at least try to take a stab at this. It's really, really worthwhile. And even more importantly, as that team changes over time, as more people come, as you incorporate resources from other teams that may not have a best practices document, train them on the at least baseline international requirements for the software that you're deploying, because this is always a moving target. You will never ever stop doing this. It's always a constant learning, training, and education process for an entire team. And the more focused you are on it, the better the results will be, and the fewer of those aforementioned lawsuits that you could potentially get yourself into. The other key message is, wherever possible, don't reinvent the wheel. A lot of these international problems have already been solved, and you can take advantage of that and leverage the extra technology that is available in .NET, for example, to reduce the amount of effort, because, I even get confused necessarily on where currency symbols are supposed to fall before or after, or not at all, things like that. It's impossible to keep track of them all. So just leverage the international libraries that are available, and there is also tons and tons of documentation available on all of these things that we talked about. I've got a great set of links to all the things that we discussed here, plus some more stuff. That's a great place to get started. There is really no substitute for knowing what you're doing, and that cuts across the entire team. So just get educated and know before you go. Also, a handy little resource that we have is this fellow whose name isn't actually Dr. International. He actually has a real name. But at Microsoft, we have a guy who represents the sort of international side of software development. So if you get into a situation where it's not covered here, and it's not covered in any of the documentation I gave you, you can just go onto this handy little website over here and ask a direct question. I'm not sure what the turnaround time is necessarily off the top of my head, but he'll do his best to get back to you if you provide all the information that is required, and things like what programming environment you're doing it in, what's the deployment, things like that. So a bunch of different handy resources. Speaking of the resources, here they are. Now, there's a bunch of them here. I'm going to, a couple things. I have printouts of this slide right here up over on stage. And for those who are going to be watching this online, streaming it later, I'm going to try, I don't know if I can, but I'm going to try to put these links into the comments of this video. So if you're watching this years later, then try to go into the comments and get the URLs for these sorts of things. Hopefully that will work out. I'm not sure, but we'll give it a shot. So anyway, that is actually all we have for this presentation. If anybody has any questions, then I invite you to grab the microphone and we'll go from here.
My question is about flags. I've been designing a long time and typically tend to avoid flags as a general rule at Microsoft. Although I noticed that Apple is doing something kind of weird with a flag at the very bottom of their site, and it almost looks like just a bomb ready to explode. Yeah. So I was wondering what your opinion was about usage of flags.
I actually cut flags out of this presentation for time, and since I finished earlier, I probably shouldn't have. But you're absolutely right. Flags have two different ramifications. Don't use flags in your application at all, anywhere, period. Just don't. It's not a great idea. It puts you in the business of having to maintain the current flag for any given country. They do change. Recently, the Iraqi flag changed, and you don't want to be in the business of making sure that you don't insult all of the Iraqi people. So it's best to just avoid the situation entirely by not using flags. Flags also bring up another important point, which is color. Color choices within applications, especially if they bear a remarkable resemblance to a country's flag, can actually be a bad idea, especially if not all countries in the world like the particular country that you happen to be almost representing with your color choices. So it is generally best to try to avoid flag-like color choices within your application and try to avoid looking like a flag in any way, shape, or form. You also actually, one follow-up point is that it is not always the best idea to necessarily take things that you see and what other people are doing and apply them. So just because Apple's doing it doesn't necessarily mean it's right. For example, there was a major analytics web tool that was released by a large online software company that if you went and the very first day they changed the UI, they added maps to it, which, as we all know, is dangerous. And within that application, you could identify Taiwan as a country. This is a bad idea because actually, that reminds me. Never refer to anything as a country. Always refer to it as a country region. And the reason for this intentional nebulousness is because, again, you don't want to be in the business of saying Taiwan is a country and then having your software banned in China. So it is extremely important that you take into account the point that countries and regions are not going to be arbitrated by you or your software, and it's really best to just take into account the nebulousness of this sort of thing and try to avoid problems like that. And sometimes it's simply as easy as nomenclature. Rather than referring to things as country, call them country regions. Or country/region, things like that. It's pretty easy. thanks for the question. Next.
Yeah, when you're talking to a server as a service, it might be fatal to use localized strings or representation. For example, there's a bug in the Office communicator because it uses US English locale for talking to the server. And a friend of mine, he's got an English user interface, but he didn't like the Camera and 1000 delimiter, so he changed it to the German version.
Right.
And it broke the code, actually.
Right. Actually, you do bring up a good point. And all of this actually doesn't take into account client-server interactions, which actually do complicate matters. And this is another one of those scenarios where the server-side teams, even though they may not necessarily think of themselves as having to handle international issues because they're not on the UI side, it really can matter. And little tiny things like locale selections within applications and how they communicate back to servers can have a pretty tremendous downstream ramification. So in this scenario, that's one of the things, and not even Microsoft gets it right all the time. To be honest, this stuff is hard, and it just requires a certain amount of discipline by everybody involved. And your example was a good one of where it didn't work out. And I do encourage those who are writing client-server applications to encourage the server-side devs, even though they may think of themselves as just essentially plumbers moving data around, that international matters to them too. Anybody else? Nope. I think we're good. All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming out. You are done. You're free. Mix is over.